By the time Clara Vance saw the three riders in the canyon mouth, she had already counted the wagon tracks twice. The Arizona sun stood almost straight overhead, bleaching the sandstone until the whole pass seemed to glow from inside. Cinder, her gray mountain pony, slowed without being asked. He was a compact, ugly little animal with one torn ear and the good sense to distrust men who waited in shade while their horses sweated in open ground. Clara let the reins rest against his neck. The tracks interested her more than the rifles. 4 iron-rimmed wagons had passed through recently. Heavy ones. The ruts were deep on the outer edges where loaded wheels had bitten into the dry earth, and the spacing told her the axles were broader than ordinary ranch carts. She saw crushed juniper where something long had overhung a wagon bed. Timber, probably. Iron, too, judging from the glittering filings near a rock. The man in the center watched her reading the dirt. He was clean in a way nobody stayed clean by accident out here. Black coat, pale shirt, boots polished despite 3 days of dust blowing through the gorge. The holster at his hip was too expensive for a working hand. Clara knew his type before she knew his name. A man who paid other people to become dirty on his behalf. The broad one beside him spat tobacco near Cinder's hoof. Roads closed. Clara looked up. Doesn't look closed. The broad man's smile showed a chipped front tooth. It is to you, the clean man said. Silas, that was all, but the warning in it was precise. Silas Grissom shifted in his saddle. His eyes moved over Clara's small frame, the patched brown skirt split for riding, the rolled blanket, the short-handled shovel tied beside her saddle. His amusement returned. You lost, miss? No. Then you're headed for Ironstalk's place. She gave him nothing. The clean man introduced himself as Preston Thorne, representative of the Southwestern Range and Cattle Company. His voice sounded practiced, like a clerk reading a notice from behind a counter. The company, he explained, was conducting surveys. There had been disputes over title and water access. For her own safety, she should turn around. Clara slid down from Cinder. Grissom laughed. She ignored him and crouched by the nearest rut. She measured its width with the span of her hand, then scraped away loose dust until she found the compacted base. There was charcoal grit mixed with the dirt. Somebody had hauled forge work recently. She stood and looked at the northern wall of the pass, at the angle where a loaded wagon would have to slow. You planning to bring something bigger through here? She asked. For the first time, Thorne's expression changed, only slightly. A narrowing around the eyes. Grissom leaned forward. What business is that of yours? None yet, she remounted. Grissom guided his horse into Cinder's path. Little thing like you won't last a week in that basin. The old giant doesn't run a boarding house. Clara looked at the horse first, not the man. Big chest, fine legs. Too much weight above the shoulders for broken country. Then she looked at Grissom. Move. His face reddened. Thorne said, let her go. Clara had expected that. Men like Thorne preferred to learn what they could before closing a fist. She turned Cinder away from the main track. Wrong road, Grissom called. Clara aimed the pony toward a narrow gray band of shale climbing the east ridge. Behind her came Thorne's voice. There is no road there. Exactly. She heard Grissom swear. Then hoofbeats. 2 riders came after her. Clara did not urge Cinder into a blind run. Speed killed horses on broken rock. Instead, she leaned forward and gave the pony his head, letting him choose among stones. His small hooves touched where the larger horses behind him punched through loose scree. Clara counted under her breath. 3 short strides, 1 long. Shift left, breathe. Let the slope move under them instead of fighting it. The shale field steepened. A rock clattered away beneath Cinder and clicked down the ravine for what seemed an impossibly long time. One of the pursuing horses snorted in panic. Clara kept her eyes ahead. At the shelf above the shale, she turned along a ledge no wider than a kitchen table. Wind moved cold through the cut and dried the sweat at the back of her neck. Cinder flattened his body toward the cliff. Behind her, a man shouted, Damn it, pull up. There was scrambling a curse, the metallic crack of a horseshoe striking stone. Clara reached a wire tire patch and stopped. Far below, the 2 riders were backing their mounts down toward the safer trail. She could see Grissom at the canyon floor, one hand on his saddle horn, staring up. Thorne stood beside him. Even at that distance, Clara could feel the man's attention. She turned Cinder toward the basin. The first thing she saw beyond the ridge was green. Not much. A ribbon of cottonwoods. A meadow faded by late summer, darker brush following an invisible watercourse. But after miles of hard country, the basin looked almost impossible. At its western end, where 2 cliffs pinched together, stood a wall of stacked stone and 2 cedar gates tall enough to stop a freight wagon. Behind them rose a ranch house built low against the earth, more fortress than home. Clara had heard stories in the settlement. Nisha Ironstalk, Apache, rancher, mason, difficult man, giant man, owned water nobody could explain, wouldn't sell, wouldn't leave, had buried more fence posts than most men had cut fence wire. Some stories made him a monster, others a saint. Clara had learned that frontier stories usually told more about the speaker than the person being described. She rode down. The gates were open. Inside the courtyard, chickens scratched under a wagon. A blacksmith's hammer rang somewhere behind a stone wall. The air smelled of cedar resin, horse manure, chilies drying on a string, and water. Real water, cool enough that Clara could smell minerals in it. She dismounted. 2 hands by the corral stopped working. One elbowed the other. That her? That what? The help from Benson. The second man looked at Clara, then at the spade on her saddle. They sent half a hand. Clara untied her bedroll. Which half do you need? The first man barked a laugh. The second did not. He was older, with white sun scars at his temples. You Clara Vance? Yes. A shadow moved beneath the porch roof. The man who stepped out made the doorway look poorly designed. Nisha Ironstalk was not merely tall. He was broad through the chest and shoulders, built by years of lifting things that did not want to be lifted. Dark hair, streaked with silver, touched his collar. Pale scar ran from the base of his left thumb halfway to the wrist. He wore plain work clothes, no gun belt, no decoration meant to impress anyone. He came down the porch steps and stopped in front of Clara. She had to tilt her head farther than she liked. He looked at Cinder, the saddle, the repaired stirrup leather, the short spade, the coil of rope, then at her boots. Finally, he held out one hand, palm up. Clara frowned. Your hands, he said. His voice was low and rough. She removed her gloves. The corral men went quiet. Clara's palms had none of the softness Grissom had imagined. Rope burns had left pale ridges across the base of her fingers. The skin below her thumb was thick where shovel handles rubbed. A crescent scar crossed one knuckle from a broken trace chain. Nisha took her right hand. His own nearly swallowed it. He did not squeeze to test her, which Clara appreciated. Men often mistook pain for proof. He turned her palm toward the light and studied it the way she had studied the wagon rut. Where'd you get this? He touched the crescent scar, flooded crossing outside Silver Wells. Mule team panicked. You saved the wagon? The flour. Wagon went over. One of the men by the corral laughed again, but this time without mockery. Nisha released her hand and walked to Cinder. He pulled Clara's short spade free and balanced it across 2 fingers. The blade had been shortened and reground until the weight sat close to the handle. You did this? My father hated it. Said a proper shovel should make a woman wish she had a brother. Nisha glanced at her. Your father sounds tiring. Clara almost smiled. He returned the tool. The older ranch hand said, Boss, she won't reach the top hinge. Nisha looked toward the cedar gates. Neither will you without a ladder, Eli, yet I still feed you. The younger hand snorted. Nisha looked back at Clara. You know stone? Enough to know when it wants to move. Water? Enough to know when it shouldn't. Then eat first. Work after. There was no ceremony, no welcome speech. He turned toward the house as if the matter had been settled. Clara stood in the yard with her gloves in one hand. She had traveled 200 miles because a freight driver in Benson told her Ironstalk needed someone small enough to inspect old irrigation vents. She had expected another humiliating interview, another man asking whether she could cook before he asked whether she could repair a gate. Instead, Nisha had looked at her hands. That frightened her more than ridicule did. Ridicule was easy to resist. Recognition could make a person stay. Dinner was beans, charred corn cakes, onions fried in bacon fat, and coffee strong enough to scrape sleep from the bones. Clara ate at a long table with Nisha, Eli, the younger hand named Tom Rusk, and 2 brothers who worked the north pasture. Nobody asked Clara to speak about herself. That suited her. Afterward, Nisha took a lantern and led her behind the kitchen, down a path between 2 basalt shelves. He stopped at what looked like a pile of brush. Under it was a cedar hatch. When he opened it, cool air breathed out of the earth. Clara smelled limestone, wet wood, silt. Acequias, Nisha said. She had seen open irrigation ditches before. Everybody in the territory had. This was different. A narrow stone channel disappeared under the mountain, covered in places with slabs and cedar beams. The main line was large enough for Nisha to crouch in, but 20 feet farther the ceiling dropped. Water moved through the dark with a steady murmur. He showed her vents hidden behind stonework, small bypass channels, cedar sluice controls, and pressure reliefs. Some parts were old, some repaired with newer iron. It was not a single system built at one time. It was generations of problem-solving layered together. Nisha rested his palm on a damp stone. Company men see this water and think ditch. They see the spring and think pipe. They don't know how much of the basin lives because the water goes underground before the heat can take it. Clara crouched near a narrow branch. How far? Quarter mile to first throat. Farther if you're willing to crawl. She listened. There was a faint whistle beneath the stronger rush. Something's catching there. Nisha's eyes moved to her. Where? Clara pointed toward the eastern branch. He held the lantern closer. You can hear that? I can hear air where there shouldn't be air. Nisha sat back on his heels. That's why you're here. Clara looked at the opening. It was barely wider than her shoulders. The job suddenly made sense. Nisha could move half a wall by himself. But his strength ended where the mountain narrowed. Clara's whole life had been spent adapting to a world built too large for her. She owned short handles, narrow tools, altered saddles, steps made from old crates. She had learned to use leverage because she could not rely on mass. The same things that made ordinary ranch work harder for her made these vents possible. How often do they block? More every year. You been maintaining the narrow sections at all? Nisha gave her a look. With what part of me? This time she did smile. The next morning she went into the mountain. She wore canvas trousers borrowed from Tom and cinched twice at the waist. Nisha gave her a small brass lamp with a leather head strap and a pouch of cedar wedges. He explained the first branch once, then made her repeat it back. If you get turned around, follow flow until first fork. Left fork rises, right fork returns to intake. If the lamp dies, hand on north wall, count braces. If stone shifts, don't fight it unless it pins air. He nodded. Clara crawled inside. Within yards, the heat vanished. Cold water soaked through her knees. The ceiling lowered until her shoulder blades brushed stone. She moved with slow breaths, feeling every change in pressure through her palms. At the first throat, she had to exhale completely and turn one shoulder ahead of the other. Her chest scraped through with less than an inch to spare. On the far side, the whistle grew louder. She found the obstruction at a filter vent. River gravel packed behind calcified mud around an iron lever. The lever had not moved in years. Clara worked with a short pick, removing grit a spoonful at a time. She did not yank. Old systems punished impatience. When the last stone came loose, water surged past her wrist with a colder, cleaner pulse. The whistle disappeared. She stayed still and listened. The new sound was deeper, smooth. A living thing breathing freely again. Outside, Nisha waited by the intake pool. Clara emerged gray with silt. Hair stuck to her forehead. He looked at the water. Better. You could say thank you. Could. He handed her a cloth and a canteen. Will you? Maybe after the third vent. Clara drank and laughed into the canteen before she could stop herself. That evening, they sat at the kitchen table after the others went to the bunkhouse. Nisha used a burned twig to draw the water system in dust near the flower crock. He marked the spring, the covered channel, the lower fields, the overflow cut that led to the gorge. Thorne wants the spring? Clara asked. He wants every ranch downstream dependent on his company. He owns cattle but not enough water to move them through a dry season. If he controls this basin, he controls who sells and who leaves. His papers any good? Nisha's mouth flattened. Good enough to keep lawyers paid. My family used this water before his company had a name. Territorial offices lost records when convenient, found new ones when money asked. Clara traced the map with one finger. He's hauling timber and iron through the pass. Nisha looked up. How much? She told him what she had seen in the ruts. He did not ask whether she was certain. He stood, took a wrench from a peg by the door and handed her a lantern. Gates. They worked past midnight. Nisha lifted the heavy cross braces while Clara crawled beneath the lowest hinge plates and cleaned compacted grit from the sockets. At one point he tried to push a wet rawhide binding through a gap between cedar and stone. His fingers would not fit. Clara held out her hand. He gave her the strip. She pushed her whole arm into the crevice, cheek against the post, and caught the far end with 2 fingers. The hide smelled sour and salty. She looped it around the hidden peg and fed it back. Nisha showed her his binding method, then made her tie the second one. The figure 8 tightened as the rawhide dried, drawing cedar and stone together. You learned this from your father? Clara asked. My mother's brother. He said rope tells you when a knot is wrong if you listen to it. Rope talks too? Everything talks. Most people are noisy. She tightened the last turn. That was almost a joke. Don't spread it around. By the end of the week, Clara knew the ranch by smell in the dark. The forge smelled of coal and wet iron. The grain room smelled sweet and dusty. The lower channel carried moss and minerals. She learned that Nisha drank coffee after midnight and hated cinnamon, that Eli sang off-key while repairing tack, that Tom Rusk apologized for mocking her by silently shortening the handle on a heavy tamping tool and leaving it outside her room. She also learned that Preston Thorne did not quit. Before Thorne returned, Nisha took Clara south to Miller's place to settle a smaller problem that showed her why the company wanted the basin so badly. Miller's ranch sat on flatter ground where the grass grew thin and gray between patches of alkaline soil. His cattle were leaner than Nisha's. A windmill turned above the yard with a squeal every sixth revolution. Miller met them beside a dry stock pond. He was a square man in his 50s with a sunburned nose and a way of speaking to Nisha while looking past Clara. "Lower Creek dropped again," he said. "If you can spare another half day from the overflow, I can keep the west pasture alive until market." Nisha looked at Clara. Miller followed his gaze and frowned. "What's she got to do with it? She knows the vents." Miller gave Clara the same quick measurement she had seen from dozens of men. Height first, hands second, if they bothered. "No offense, miss, but I'm asking about water enough for 80 head. "Then you should be precise," Clara said. "How deep is your west trough?" Miller blinked. "What? Length and depth. How many head drink there at midday? How long are they held before rotation?" He looked at Nisha as if expecting rescue. Nisha folded his arms, Miller answered. Clara crouched and drew figures in dust with a nail. The basin could spare water, but not by simply opening the lower gate longer. Doing that would starve the east channel where Nisha's young cottonwoods shaded the banks. Instead, she proposed a shorter release before dawn, when evaporation was lower, combined with closing Miller's cracked feeder ditch for 1 hour, so his pond filled before cattle entered. Miller listened despite himself. "You figure all that from a trough? From a leaking ditch you haven't repaired." He looked toward the feeder line. "It leaks a little. It leaks enough to water 3 acres of weeds." Nisha made a sound suspiciously close to a cough hiding laughter. Miller's ears reddened. They walked the ditch. At a bend, Clara found a collapsed bank where water had been disappearing under a mat of salt grass. She pushed her hand into the mud and felt the draw beneath it. There. Miller knelt. "Damn. Patch that before sunset. We'll release at 4 tomorrow morning." 2 hours, not half a day. Miller looked at Nisha again. "That enough?" Nisha said, "She told you." The answer landed harder than if he had raised his voice. On the ride back, Clara was quiet. Nisha let her be quiet for nearly a mile. Then he said, "You enjoyed that. No, you did. Only the part where his ditch was leaking exactly where I said. So all of it." Clara smiled despite herself. The smile faded when they reached a ridge overlooking the southern flats. From there, she could see how many ranches depended on the basin's drainage. Thin green lines branched away from Nisha's land into country that looked otherwise dead. Miller's place. 2 smaller claims east of it. A settlement garden farther south. "Thorne doesn't just want your cattle water," she said. "No. He wants everyone below you negotiating with him." Nisha rested both hands on his saddle horn. "Control the dry season, and you control prices. Miller sells when told. Small ranches borrow when told. By the time rain comes, debt owns what water did not." Clara watched dust move across the flats. She had thought the cedar gates protected one stubborn man's property. Now she understood they protected a pressure point in an entire valley. Miller know? He knows enough to be afraid. Not enough to stop laughing when men like Thorne call me difficult. He laughed at me too. People laugh cheaply. Learning costs more. The next morning, Clara opened the lower release before dawn. By sunrise, Miller's west pond held water again. At breakfast, Tom asked if the southern rancher had thanked her. "No. You should have charged him." Clara tore a corn cake in half. "I did." Tom looked interested. "What'd you charge?" He had to listen. Nisha drank his coffee and said nothing. But the corner of his mouth moved. He returned at noon on a white-faced horse with 6 men behind him. Clara and Nisha met them at the cedar gates. Thorne wore the same black coat, though the day was hot enough to soften saddle wax. He produced a cream envelope stamped with a territorial seal. "Final notice," he said. "My company has acquired the disputed claims adjacent to the basin. We are prepared to purchase your remaining interest at a generous rate. If you refuse, we will petition for receivership an injunctive control of the water pending review. Nisha stood with his hands loose at his sides. Thorne held out the envelope. Nisha looked at Clara. One small nod. She stepped forward and took it. Thorne's jaw tightened as he lowered his hand to her height. Clara opened the envelope there in the road. "You read legal print?" Thorne asked. "Enough to know when somebody uses 6 paragraphs to say, 'Give me your well.'" A few of his men smirked before catching themselves. Thorne ignored them. "Miss Vance, you are new here. You have no stake in this dispute. I would advise you not to confuse temporary employment with ownership." Clara folded the paper. "That's good advice. You should take it." Grissom's hand moved toward his revolver. Nisha did not move at all. That was enough. Thorne turned his horse. "The offer expires in 48 hours. Clara watched the riders disappear between the red walls. Then she looked at Nisha. "He didn't come to make an offer. No. He came to see what we'd reinforced." "Yes." Nisha took the notice from her and used it to light the cook stove that evening. 2 days later, Clara spotted a flash on the north ridge. She was carrying fence staples when the sun caught glass high above the basin. She set the bucket down, crouched under salt Cedar, and watched, a telescope. The man behind it was Josiah Blackwood, one of Thorne's scouts, thin, cautious, better on foot than Grissom's men. Clara found a shard of green bottle glass near an old fire ring. She angled it until the sunlight struck his lens. The flare was violent. Blackwood jerked back. Clara moved while he was blind, crossing 2 open patches and disappearing behind a basalt spine. When she looked again from a different angle, Blackwood was searching the wrong place. That night, she told Nisha, he listened while planing a cedar wedge. "Let him look," he said. "At what? What we choose." 3 nights later, Blackwood came inside the outer wall. Nisha had expected him. The moon was thin. Clara watched from a roof ledge as the scout crept along the western foundation, feeling for loose stone. He found nothing because Nisha's walls were not built by men paid per foot. Then Nisha stepped from the dark. Blackwood nearly fell backward. The big rancher did not threaten him. Instead, he walked to a section of wall near a drainage cut and shifted a decoy stone with his boot. Mortar dust fell. A dark gap appeared behind it. Nisha walked away. Blackwood stared. Clara could almost hear him thinking. He knelt, touched the opening, then hurried back toward the pass. After he was gone, Clara climbed down. "You showed him a weakness." "No. I showed him what he came to find." Nisha replaced the stone. Behind it was not the courtyard. It was an overflow chamber connected to the coldest branch of the Acequias, Clara understood. If they put powder there, water takes it. If they crawl in, water takes them too. She considered the height of the chamber. Not if we only fill it to the waist. Nisha looked at her. Enough to ruin powder and make men reconsider their careers. His mouth twitched. Build it that way. The next morning they redirected the overflow. It took 4 hours. Nisha shifted stones. Clara crawled inside and fitted wedges. They argued twice about pressure. Clara won one argument and lost the other. At noon they ate cold beans beside the channel, shoulders touching because the strip of shade was narrow. Nothing about it felt grand. That was why Clara trusted it. Belonging, she was beginning to understand, was not a speech. It was somebody handing you the good wrench without asking whether you could lift it. It was knowing who took salt and who didn't. It was being expected at the table when the beans were burned. The first real sabotage came at midday. Clara was checking the east vent when the water's sound changed. The usual low rush sharpened into a hiss. She put her palm against basalt. Air, too much. She ran, not along the road, through creosote and low scrub where a mounted man could not follow quickly. Half a mile out, she found Grissom and 2 scouts prying at an exposed junction with iron bars. Water leaked in a muddy thread. Grissom had his back to her. Clara did not draw her revolver. A gunshot would turn sabotage into a gunfight, and gunfights were poor tools for fixing pipes. She crawled behind the rise and reached a maintenance opening farther down the line. Inside, cold water already filled the channel to her knees. The broken joint was upstream. Pressure shook the cedar brace. She wedged a flat basalt slab against the breach. It slipped. She tried again, bracing her shoulder under the ceiling. The current rose to her thighs. Her tool pouch snagged behind her. She needed a tie. Her hand went automatically to the blue silk ribbon, holding her hair. For a second she stopped. The ribbon had belonged to her mother, not a valuable thing. A narrow strip faded nearly gray at the ends. Clara had worn it on every move since the funeral because it was the one soft object nobody had managed to use against her. The brace shuddered. She pulled the ribbon free. Her hair fell into her face as she wrapped the silk around the iron and stone. Once, twice, 4 times. She cinched it with a timber hitch and jammed a cedar sliver beneath the binding. The silk held long enough for the wedge to seat. Water slowed. Clara pushed wet mortar into the seam with her fingers until her nails hurt. When she crawled out again, Grissom's group had retreated. Nisha had met Thorne on the boundary road and kept the larger force occupied without firing a shot. Clara stood dripping beside the intake. Nisha's eyes went to her loose hair. He said nothing. She preferred that. They walked back toward the corral in late light. Clara smelled something wrong before she saw it. Sweet, bitter underneath. A small pile of oats lay near the north fence. She crouched. Molasses coated the grain. White crystals clung to the husks. Nisha called for Eli. Clara used a twig to turn one oat. Poison, what kind? Eli asked. Likely strychnine. Burn the scattered feed. Check every bin before dark. Tom Rusk swore and headed for the barn. Nisha looked toward the pass. They've stopped pretending. Clara stood. Her knees shook from cold and exhaustion, though the evening remained warm. Good, she said. Nisha looked down at her. Good? Pretending takes time. Now we know what they are. That night nobody slept much. Before dawn, Clara took a shovel and walked the canyon. The moon was gone. The pass lay under stars so sharp they looked hammered into black metal. She carried no lantern. After a month at the ranch, she could find the white quartz marker near the outer bend by memory. Nisha followed with a coil of rope over one shoulder. They climbed the slope above the trail and stopped beneath a shelf of loose shale. During the monsoon, water had cut a shallow seam behind it. A hard push in the right place would send rock across the road. A hard push in the wrong place could take half the ridge with it. Clara crouched and studied the angle. We can block the trail without dropping the big shelf. Nisha planted a cedar stake. Show me. She laid out stones in the dust to represent the slope. She marked the road, the horses, the likely line of approach. Nisha watched without interrupting. If Grissom comes fast, he will bunch his men here. She tapped the bend, not because he is stupid, because this wall hides the gate until the last 100 yards. He'll want everyone together before he sees you. And the animals? We release after the lead horse passes the marker. It closes the road behind them, not on them. Nisha considered the ridge. That leaves them trapped between gate and rock. Only until we open the upper footpath. You want to give them a retreat? Clara looked at him. I want them frightened, not buried. Dead men make martyrs. Frightened men make stories. Nisha grunted, which Clara had learned could mean agreement. They spent the coldest hour before sunrise building a lever from cedar and setting a release pin beneath the unstable seam. Nisha did the lifting. Clara did the measuring. When they finished, the mechanism looked like nothing. A weathered pole among brush, a rope hidden under gravel. On the way back, they passed the lower pasture. One of the mares nickered. Clara stopped to rub the animal's nose. Nisha waited. My father would have sold this mare first, Clara said. Nisha did not ask why. When feed got short, he sold whatever didn't pull the most weight. Chickens, then calves, then my mother's things. He used to look at me like I belonged in the same list. The mare pushed into her palm. Nish leaned his forearms on the fence. He wrong? Clara almost snapped at him, then saw his face. He was not mocking her. About the mare? About you. She stared at the animal. I don't know yet. Nisha nodded once. Then keep working. It was the most useful kindness anyone had offered her. The attack came the following night. Silas Grissom led 8 riders into the gorge after moonrise. They wrapped cloth around the horses' bits and carried carbines under blankets, as if muffled metal could make 8 men invisible in a canyon that magnified every hoofbeat. Clara waited above them in a crack in the rock. The space was so narrow she could brace her back against one wall and her boots against the other. From there she saw the trail in slices between scrub branches. The first horse passed the quartz marker. The second, Grissom rode third. Clara let 4 more pass, then she pulled the release. For a breath nothing happened. The cedar pin creaked, a stone clicked loose. Then the slope began to move. Not an avalanche, a controlled pour. Shale whispered down first, followed by fist-sized rock, then 3 larger boulders that rolled into the road and stopped against the opposite wall. Dust exploded upward. The rear horses shied back. Grissom swore and wheeled around. The road behind him vanished beneath a rough barrier 5 feet high. From the gate ridge came a single arrow. It struck the dirt 10 feet ahead of the lead horse. Another hit behind the group. A third buried itself beside Grissom's boot. Men raised rifles. Show yourself. Grissom shouted. Nisha stood somewhere above the line, unseen. A fourth arrow shattered the glass of a lantern. Darkness rushed in. The horses began to dance. A young rider fired blindly toward the ridge. The shot cracked against the stone and echoed back so many times that the men ducked from their own sound. Clara climbed out of the crevice and moved along the upper ledge. She reached the narrow footpath they had left open and kicked a small stack of pale stones into the trail. The sound drew one scout's attention. He saw the path. "There! We can get out there!" Grissom yelled at him to hold position. The man ignored him. One rider left, then two. Within a minute the rest followed. Grissom was last. He looked up toward the darkness where Clara stood. She knew he could not see her face. He could see only a small outline above him. "You think this is funny?" he shouted. Clara said nothing. He fired. The bullet hit rock below her and sent a hot chip across her cheek. Nisha's next arrow struck Grissom's hat brim and ripped it from his head. The enforcer flinched so hard his horse nearly threw him. Then he fled. When the last hoofbeat faded, Clara sat on a cold boulder and pressed 2 fingers to her cheek. They came away with a thin line of blood. Nisha descended the ridge. "You hit? Stone." He crouched, examined the cut, then gave her a strip torn from a clean handkerchief. "Your aim was showy," she said. His hat was loud. "You missed his head by an inch." "I did not miss." Clara tied the cloth against her cheek. For once, Nisha smiled openly. It changed his face so completely she laughed. The laugh surprised both of them. They sat there while the dust settled through starlight. No speech followed, no promise. Clara had known men who could turn one quiet moment into a claim of ownership. Nisha did not. He rose when the air grew colder and offered her the rope to carry. At the Syndicate camp, Preston Thorne listened to Grissom's report with both hands resting on a folding desk. He had received 2 telegrams that day. The first came from the company office in Santa Fe. Costs were rising. A rail contract depended on moving cattle through the territory before winter. The second came from a board member in New York who had never seen Arizona and wanted to know why one spring and one Indian holding had delayed an acquisition for 6 weeks. Thorne read the messages until the paper softened under his fingers. He had built his position by making difficult things look inevitable. He entered a town, found the debt, found the ambitious clerk, found the family willing to sell first, and converted resistance into signatures. Men above him admired efficiency. Men below him feared consequences. The basin had become personal because it was visible failure. Grissom stood by the fire with dust in his hair and a torn hat. "They had the ridge prepared," he said. "That little bitch pulled the slide. I saw her." Thorne looked up slowly. "You saw her after you rode into the trap she designed?" Grissom's face hardened. "Give me 20 men. I gave you 8. 8 wasn't enough. 8 was plenty for a ranch with 5 hands and an old man." Grissom stepped closer. "He isn't an old man." Thorne stood. "No, he is a rancher. She is a hired woman. And you are making both of them larger every time you come back with another excuse." The fire snapped. Josiah Blackwood watched from beyond the light. He had no affection for Nisha or Clara. He worked for money because money was easier to trust than causes. But he had spent enough nights on the ridge to understand that Thorne's plan was no longer about a clean acquisition. Thorne walked to the supply wagon and placed one boot on the wheel. "Bring the powder crates from the railhead." Grissom's anger vanished. "In that gorge? At the gate. The concussion could bring down the wall. Then we will own the stones too." Blackwood shifted in the dark. Thorne heard him. "Something to add, Josiah? Only that water runs under half that pass. Blast the wrong seam, and you may lose the road." Thorne smiled without warmth. "Then don't blast the wrong seam." By afternoon, 2 heavy wagons were rolling toward the basin with iron-bound powder crates under tarpaulins. Clara felt them before she saw them. She was kneeling in the ranch house, ear near the flagstone floor. The vibration came in a slow rhythm unlike cavalry. Wheel drag, heavy load. More than one wagon, Nisha stood in the doorway. "Powder," Clara said. He did not question it. Outside, Tom, Rusk, and Eli were soaking blankets in the stock trough. The brothers from the north pasture carried buckets to the gate. Everybody worked quietly. Nisha found Clara at the west hinge. "Back trail is open," he said. She kept tightening an iron brace. "Good, Cinder is saddled." Clara stopped. Nisha looked toward the northern ridge. "You can take the high path before they close the pass." "So can Tom chose to stay. So did I." Nisha's jaw tightened. "This isn't the same as a broken vent. I know. Powder doesn't care what size you are. Neither does water." He said her name once. "Clara." She put down the wrench. Do not send me away because you finally found something too big to protect me from. That's exactly what everyone else has done. They decide I'm fragile, then they call the decision kindness. Nisha looked at her for a long moment. I am not everyone else. Then don't act like them. The words sat between them. A hawk called somewhere above the cliffs. Nisha exhaled through his nose. What do you need? Clara picked up the wrench. Upper reservoir full? Nearly. Overflow line clear? Yes. Then I need 6 cedar wedges, 2 lengths of rope, the small mallet, and nobody touching the secondary sluice until I say. Nisha nodded. You get stuck, I pull you out. You pull too early. You drown their powder before it's in range. That wasn't a question. Clara met his eyes. Fine. If I get stuck, pull me out. Good. She started toward the Acequias entrance. Clara. She looked back. Nisha held out the blue handkerchief she had used on her cheek the night before, washed and dried. You lost your ribbon. She took the cloth. This is ugly. Then the mountain won't steal it. She tied it around her hair. The inner vent was worse in darkness. Clara stripped off her coat and crawled in wearing a thin work shirt. Cold water covered the floor. She pushed a pouch of wedges ahead of her and carried the mallet between her teeth at the tightest throat. The plan was simple only when explained from a table. The upper reservoir fed 3 pressure channels. Normally, the bypass relieved excess water into a lower wash. Clara intended to shut 2 channels, build temporary pressure in the third, and open the gorge vents only after the powder wagons committed to the final approach. Too early, and Thorne would simply wait for the water to drain. Too late, and the gates would disappear in fire. She reached the secondary sluice and tested the lever. It moved. Above ground, the first wagon entered the final bend. Grissom drove it himself. 4 horses leaned into the harness. The wagon bed carried a heavy cedar beam, and farther back, the powder crates. Thorne rode behind with 12 armed men. Nisha stood outside the cedar gates. He held no rifle. Grissom laughed when he saw him. Move, giant. Nisha placed both hands on the gate bar. The wagon accelerated. Clara could feel it through the tunnel, a pounding vibration traveling down the stone like a second heartbeat. She counted. 1, 2, 3 above. Nisha yanked the gate bar free and turned it lengthwise. At the last second, he drove one end into the spokes of the wagon's front wheel. The cedar caught. The wheel exploded. Iron shrieked. The wagon slewed sideways and dug into the wash. Grissom flew from the bench and hit the ground, rolling. The horses screamed and pulled against tangled traces. Nisha dropped the broken bar and went immediately to the team, cutting leather straps to keep the animals from going down under the wagon. That moment mattered to Clara later. He had an enemy on the ground and rifles pointed at him, yet he went to the horses first. Thorne shouted for the second wagon to advance. Men pulled the first crates free and dragged them toward the gate under covering fire. Bullets chipped stone. Eli and Tom stayed behind the parapet. Nobody returned fire unless a clear target presented itself. Clara reached the pressure chamber. The space narrowed around her ribs. She wedged her boots against opposing walls and closed the first bypass. Water changed pitch. She closed the second. The lever fought her. She pushed harder. The tunnel vibrated. Above, Thorne's men carried 2 powder crates to the western wall. Blackwood moved with them, face pale. He saw the decoy stone Nisha had shown him days earlier. There, he called. Grissom, bleeding from one eyebrow, staggered up. Set it there. Clara's breath stopped. She was close enough to the outer chamber now to hear boots through the stone. They had taken the bait. She pulled the final lever. Nothing happened. The iron handle moved halfway and stuck. Clara froze. Silt, a pressure gate, had swollen in its channel. She reversed the lever and hit the housing with the mallet. Outside, Grissom shouted, "Fuse!" Clara struck again. The mallet glanced off iron and smashed her thumb. Pain flashed white up her arm. She bit down and hit the joint lower. The lever jumped. Water punched through the bypass. The sound changed from hum to roar. At the western wall, a thin stream burst from the decoy gap. Blackwood stepped back. What the hell? The gap exploded, not with fire, with water. A black, cold sheet hammered the powder crates, knocked the fuse man off his feet, and filled the shallow chamber to the thigh in seconds. Men scrambled backward as gray slurry poured from split boxes. Thorne stared. Clara opened the gorge vents. Water shot from 3 hidden stone mouths above the trail. The second powder wagon took the full force. Tarpaulin tore loose. Crates toppled and split. Fine black powder turned to mud and ran between the wheels. For one stunned moment, no one moved. Then Nisha laughed. It was not a triumphant roar. It was a short, disbelieving sound. as if even he had not expected the mountain to cooperate so completely. Grissom charged him. Nisha sidestepped, caught the man's wrist, and used his momentum to put him face first into the mud. He did not break the arm. He simply held Grissom there until the enforcer stopped fighting, then released him. "Take your men," Nisha said. Thorne's revolver came up. Nisha looked at it. The ranch hands raised rifles from behind stone. Thorne saw the angles. He saw his soaked powder, his overturned wagon, his hired men dripping in water they had meant to own. He lowered the gun. "This isn't over." Nisha wiped mud from one hand. "You keep saying that." The Syndicate withdrew. Clara remained in the tunnel until the pressure settled. When she crawled out, dusk had gone blue over the basin. Her right thumb was swollen. Her elbows were bloody. The ugly handkerchief had come loose and hung behind one ear. Nisha waited at the hatch. He offered his hand. Usually he did not. Clara took it. He pulled her into the open. "Powder's wet," he said. "I noticed." "You all right?" "No." He waited. "My thumb hurts. I'm hungry. Tom put too much salt in the beans yesterday, and I can still taste it." Nisha's face softened. "Then you're all right enough." At supper, nobody celebrated loudly. Tom's beans were better. Eli poured Clara a second cup of coffee without asking. One of the brothers had found Grissom's torn hat in the mud and hung it on a peg by the door. Every time Clara looked at it, she had to stop herself from smiling. Later, she stepped outside. Nisha sat on the porch, sharpening a draw knife. "You think he'll go to court now?" she asked. "No. I don't either. He'll go after the intake." Clara looked toward the dark line of the mountain. The gate was obvious. The spring was not. That made the spring more dangerous. At the Syndicate camp, Preston Thorne burned the papers. He did it carefully, one deed at a time, one notice, one signed affidavit bought from a clerk in a territorial office. Months of leverage curled in the fire and lifted away as black flakes. Blackwood stood across from him. Those copies cost money. Thorne watched a seal split in the flames. So did the powder. Grissom sat on an ammunition crate with his forearm wrapped. Hatless, muddy, furious. Thorne fed another page to the fire. "I came here believing the law could make Ironstalk reasonable. The law is useful where men fear losing their position. He has no position to lose." Blackwood said nothing. "So we stopped trying to take the ranch from the gate." Thorne looked toward the black shape of the mountains. "We take the water before it reaches him." Grissom smiled. Blackwood did not. "The intake is narrow country," he said. "You're the scout, and unstable. Then don't be under it when it moves." Thorne stood and opened an oilskin bundle. Inside were cutting tools, pry bars, coils of fuse, and a small case of detonators. "Tomorrow night we choke the upper line. After that, they can have their beautiful gates. They can sit behind them and watch their cattle die." The fire burned low. Blackwood looked at Thorne, then at Grissom. For the first time since he had taken company money, he wondered whether there was any distance left between being paid to find a weakness and being paid to bury the people behind it. Across the basin, Clara woke from a shallow sleep because the water under the floor changed its song. She sat up in darkness. For several seconds she heard only the wind against the shutters. Then the deep murmur beneath the ranch stumbled once, twice, stopped. Clara was out of bed before she knew she had moved. She stepped barefoot onto the cold flagstone and pressed her palm to it. Nothing. The Acequias had gone silent. Within minutes the house was awake. Nisha came from his room pulling on a vest. Tom stumbled from the bunkhouse with one boot unlaced. Eli lit a lantern and nearly dropped the match when Clara told him the lower line had stopped. They went outside under a moon thin as a shaving of bone. The main channel beside the courtyard still held water, but it was settling. The current had lost direction. Leaves floated without moving. At the cattle trough, a yearling pushed its nose against the inlet pipe and snorted at the empty trickle. Nisha knelt beside the channel. He put 2 fingers into the water and waited. "Upper intake," he said. Clara looked toward the dark ridge. "Could be debris from what we released today." Could. Neither believed it. They left before sunrise. Cinder carried Clara. Nisha rode a dun gelding that looked small beneath him. Eli followed with tools and rope. The trail climbed behind the basin through juniper, then narrowed beside a dry wash where pale limestone broke through red earth. The higher they went, the less water they found. A seep that normally crossed the trail was dry. Moss along a stone lip had already begun to curl at the edges. At the upper intake, the answer waited in plain sight. Fresh boot prints scarred the mud around the spring box. A cedar grate had been pried loose. The heavy iron pin that locked the upper diversion gate lay in weeds 10 yards away. Someone had rolled boulders into the feeder trench and jammed 2 cut timbers down the stone throat. Eli swore softly. Nisha stood over the damage without speaking. Clara watched him. She had seen anger from him before. It appeared as stillness rather than noise. But this was different. The muscles around his mouth slackened for a moment. His eyes moved from the dry channel to the cottonwoods below. He was calculating death. Not human death first. Cattle, horses, young trees. The kitchen garden. Families on neighboring claims who drew overflow from the lower creek. Water in a basin was never just one man's property, no matter what a deed said. It was sequence and timing. Cut the head and everything below began counting backward. How long? Clara asked. If we cannot restore main flow. 2 days before lower pasture goes dry, maybe 3 for the wells. And the plug? Nisha crouched at the intake mouth. It was no more than 18 inches at the first constriction. Inside, Clara lay on her stomach and looked in. Lantern light showed packed gravel and the end of a cut timber around the first bend. The saboteurs had not merely blocked the mouth. They had fed debris deep into the pressure throat where ordinary tools could not reach. They knew the system better than I thought, she said. Nisha touched one boot print near the grate. Narrow heel. Worn outside edge. Clara recognized it. Blackwood, maybe. Eli said we could blast the plug. Nisha looked at him. Eli sighed. Right. Stupid idea. A blast might clear the obstruction and crack the intake at the same time. Then the spring would empty into broken stone and disappear underground. Clara crawled backward. I'll go in. Eli stared at her. Nisha's answer was immediate. No, Clara sat up. He had never said it that way before. Not a warning, not an argument. A wall. You have another way? We make one. With what? A longer arm? Clara. First throat is narrower than the east vent. You can't fit. Eli can't fit. Tom can't fit. I can. You don't know what is behind the plug. Neither do you. That's why someone has to look. Nisha stood. Pressure may be trapped above it. Pull one piece wrong and the whole line opens. Then tie me off. Water can break rope, so can fear. Eli looked away, wisely deciding the ridge required close inspection. Nisha stared down at Clara. She could see the argument he wanted to make and the one he refused to make. He could not tell her she was too small. Not after everything. He could not tell her to protect herself by becoming useless. But he also did not want to watch her vanish into a hole the mountain might fill in one breath. Clara softened her voice. You hired me for the places you couldn't reach. I hired you to work. This is work. This is a grave with plumbing. Then keep hold of the rope. Nisha closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, the decision had been made. He went to his saddle and brought back the thickest hemp line. They prepared carefully. Clara removed her coat, boots, and belt. She kept the short pick, a narrow pry bar, and a small oil lamp protected by a wire cage. Nisha tied the rope around her waist instead of her ankle so a sudden pull would not wrench a joint apart. He used the same compact binding he had taught her at the Cedar gates. Clara watched his hands. They were steady until the final turn. There, for only a second, the rope trembled between his fingers. She pretended not to see. 3 tugs means stop pulling, she said. 2 means give slack. 1 hard tug means get me out whether I complain or not. If I feel water surge, I pull. Even if I give 3? Especially then, she almost argued, then nodded. Eli drove an iron anchor into packed ground and looped the line around it. Nisha wrapped the free section around his forearm. Clara lit the lamp. The intake breathed cold against her face. She went in head first. The stone scraped her shoulders immediately. After 6 feet, she had to turn her head sideways to fit. After 10, she could no longer bend her elbows normally. She pushed the lamp ahead and slid after it, using toes and fingertips. The smell changed from wet limestone to disturbed mud. She found the first piece of timber and worked it loose a fraction at a time. It had been hammered crosswise behind a natural lip in the stone. Clever, mean. Whoever said it understood enough to make removal dangerous. Clara stopped and listened. Behind the blockage, water pressed with a low, continuous vibration. Not full reservoir pressure. Something else was relieving it. A side chamber, perhaps. She removed smaller stones first and passed them backward along her body until she could push them behind her feet. The rope shifted gently at her waist as Nisha fed slack. 10 minutes became 20. Her lamp smoked, sweat cooled immediately on her neck. At last the timber moved only half an inch. Water hissed through the gap. Clara froze. The sound was wrong. Not only water, a cough, wet, human. She held her breath. From beyond the bend came a scrape, then a broken attempt at speech. Clara pushed the lamp farther through the gap. The light found a boot, then blood in shallow water. Someone was alive inside the mountain. Clara widened the gap until she could force one shoulder through. The lamp threw a weak circle into a maintenance pocket beyond the bend. A man lay against the far wall, half on his side, one leg buried beneath a slab of limestone. Mud streaked his face, his hat was gone. Blood darkened the water around his boot. Josiah Blackwood stared at her as if he had already died and found the afterlife poorly organized. "You!" he whispered. Clara pushed the lamp into the chamber and followed. The space was barely large enough for her to kneel. The slab pinning Blackwood had fallen from a cedar-supported seam overhead. Beside it lay a pry bar and the broken end of a support pin. He had been working from inside. "You blocked the intake." Blackwood closed his eyes. "Thorne wanted it dead, and you crawled in to finish the plug. Thought there was room." Clara looked at his shoulders. There had been room, barely, until the stone moved. Water seeped through cracks behind him. The pool around her ankles rose almost too slowly to notice. Blackwood noticed. "Leave me." Clara looked at him. "That's your plan? You clear that timber, pressure comes through, stone shifts. We both drown." "Probably." He gave a short, humorless laugh that turned into a cough. "You always this pleasant?" "When I find strangers inside my plumbing." She moved closer to the slab. Blackwood's face tightened. "I heard you. I was sent to ruin this place. Also heard that. Then why?" "Save your breath." Clara wedged the narrow pry bar beneath the slab. She hated him in a clean, uncomplicated way. He had watched the basin from the ridge. He had found the decoy wall. He had walked with men who poisoned grain. He had crawled into the intake, intending to cut water from people who had never threatened him. The easiest thing in the world would be to go back. No one outside knew he was here. The mountain would finish what he had started. Clara could free the blockage after his body stopped being a problem and tell herself that justice had simply arrived without paperwork. She imagined Grissom doing exactly that to her. The thought settled the matter. "Can you feel your foot?" Blackwood blinked. "Some. Can you move it?" "No, good. Means you won't be helping." She set the bar deeper. The angle was poor. Her back touched one wall and her knees the other. She could not lift the slab. She did not need to. She needed to change the load enough for Blackwood to slide free. Clara pulled 3 cedar wedges from her pouch. She placed the first beside the pry bar and tapped it inward. The stone groaned. Blackwood flinched. "Don't move. Wasn't planning on dancing. That's the first smart thing you've done here." The second wedge went under the slab near his knee. Water climbed to mid-calf. Clara listened to the pressure behind the blockage. The vibration had strengthened. Removing the outer timber had let more water into the side pocket. They had minutes, maybe less. She pulled the rope at her waist twice. Slack came immediately. Nisha was there. The knowledge steadied her. The slab lifted perhaps a quarter inch. Blackwood grunted. "Try your leg." He pulled. Nothing. Clara changed position. Boots on the opposite wall, both hands on the pry bar. She pushed with legs, back, shoulders. Metal flexed. The slab rose another fraction. Now, Blackwood dragged himself sideways. His boot caught. Clara screamed through clenched teeth and pushed harder. Something cracked above them, not the bar. Stone. A thin fracture ran across the ceiling seam. "Move." Blackwood yanked again. His leg came free. He collapsed into the water. The slab dropped where his thigh had been. At the same instant, the packed timber behind Clara shifted. Water struck the chamber with the force of a kicked door. The lamp went out. Darkness swallowed them. Clara grabbed Blackwood's coat. "Rope." He could not see her gesture, so she took his hand and closed it around the hemp at her waist. She gave one hard tug. Outside, Nisha responded. The rope snapped tight enough to bruise Clara's ribs. She wrapped one arm around Blackwood and let the pull take them. They hit the narrow throat badly. Blackwood's shoulder jammed. Cold water climbed Clara's back. "Turn!" she shouted. He twisted, screamed when his injured leg struck stone and flattened enough to move. Nisha pulled again. Clara used her feet against the wall, guiding Blackwood's head through the constriction. Gravel battered their arms. The current tried to fold them backward. For one breath, Clara lost the rope. Panic rose hot despite the freezing water. Then her hand found hemp again. She held. The next pull dragged her into light. Nisha's hands appeared first, enormous in the intake mouth. He caught Clara under the arms and hauled her onto the mud. Eli grabbed the rope behind him. Blackwood came out next, coughing water and blood. Nisha rolled him onto his side, checked his breathing, then turned to Clara. She lay on her back, staring at the sky, blue, ridiculously blue. Nisha knelt over her. "Clara, still here." He touched her face with the backs of 2 fingers as if verifying she was solid. Only then did he look at Blackwood. The scout had passed out. He did this? Clara nodded. Nietzsche's expression hardened. And you brought him out. He was blocking the tunnel. Eli barked a laugh from pure relief. Nietzsche looked at her for a long second. Of course he was. The intake began running again before sunset. Once the interior plug shifted, pressure flushed the remaining debris through the feeder line. Water returned first as a brown trickle, then as a steady cold stream that darkened the channels all the way down toward the basin. Clara sat in the intake shed wrapped in a wool blanket, while Eli splinted Blackwood's lower leg. The scout woke screaming. Nisha held his shoulders down until the splint was tied. Afterward, Blackwood stared at the ceiling, sweat bright on his forehead. You should have left me. Clara drank coffee. You've mentioned that. Thorne will kill me if he knows I failed. Then you've got problems in both directions. Blackwood looked at Nisha. The big rancher sat near the door repairing the torn hemp line. He had said almost nothing since the rescue. Why'd she do it? Blackwood asked him. Nisha kept working. Ask her. Blackwood looked back at Clara. Why? She thought about giving him a fine answer. She did not have one. Because I could. Blackwood waited. That's it? That's enough. Outside, the restored water moved over stone. Blackwood listened. Then he began to talk. Thorne had abandoned any hope of winning quickly through court. He had hired men from Tucson, Bisbee, and 2 mining camps. Not cattle hands. Men who accepted cash for work nobody entered in a ledger. The plan was for a midnight assault. A frontal group would bring a ram to the Cedar gates and keep Nietzsche's attention there. Grissom would take a smaller team up the west ridge, cross behind the wall, and open the ranch from inside. Marksmen would hold the parapets. Once the gate fell, Thorne intended to burn the feed sheds, destroy the upper controls of the Acequias, and leave the basin unusable long enough for the company to claim abandonment. He doesn't care if the water system survives now, Blackwood said. Wants you gone before the board sends somebody else to replace him. Clara looked at Nisha. There it was. Not greed alone, humiliation, fear of being seen as a man who could not finish what he promised. Men were often most dangerous when protecting the version of themselves they had sold to others. Blackwood asked for a stick. Clara handed him a charcoal nub from the stove. On the floorboards he drew the routes: West Ridge, Dry Gully, Old Goat Path, sniper positions, main ram, reserve horses. Nish memorized every line. How many? 25, maybe 30. Eli whistled softly. Blackwood looked toward the door. There's more. Thorne sent a rider to the territorial office 2 days ago. He's telling them Ironstalk attacked company agents and stole explosives. If he wins tonight, he'll have witnesses who say you started it. Clara laughed once. Nobody else did. Sorry, she said. It's just impressive. He poisons oats, blocks water, brings powder, and still finds time for paperwork. Nisha finally set down the rope. Can you ride? He asked Blackwood. Not like this. Can you write? Blackwood frowned. Yes. Nisha pointed to the small desk in the corner. Write everything you just said. Names if you know them. Sign it. Eli rides it to Marshal Bell. Blackwood's face changed. You trust the marshal? No. Then why? I trust paper more when the liar doesn't own all of it. Clara looked at Nisha. That was almost cynical. You are a bad influence. Blackwood wrote for an hour. His handwriting shook whenever pain hit his leg, but he named men, dates, locations, the poison, the powder, the diversion. He signed the statement at the bottom. Eli folded it into oilcloth and tucked it inside his shirt. If I meet Thorne's riders. Nisha said, don't. Eli stared at him. Clara said, take the East Sheep Trail. Leave your hat here. From a distance they'll look for a rider, not a fool riding bareheaded at noon. Eli grinned, handed her the hat, and left. By late afternoon, the ranch had changed shape. Not literally. The walls stood where they had always stood. But every ordinary object gained a second purpose. Water barrels were rolled behind corners for fire control. Grain sacks became breastworks near exposed gaps. Lanterns were moved away from places where they would silhouette defenders. Clara raked fine gravel across the inner courtyard so footprints would betray movement. Tom and the North Pasture brothers cut narrow firing slots in old cedar screens, then covered them with hanging blankets. Niche opened passages Clara had not known existed. One ran between the pantry wall and the outer stonework, so narrow she could move through it sideways. Another climbed behind the western parapet and ended at a viewing slit no wider than 2 fingers. A third connected the main Acequia pressure chamber to the gate foundations. You built all this for a siege? Clara asked. Nisha adjusted a stone panel. Built it because I do not like doors with only one way out. How comforting. You came anyway. She helped him check the gate mechanism. The hydraulic chamber beneath the western post had originally been designed to relieve flood pressure. Nisha had modified it years ago so a sudden release could push the gate outward a few feet. Not enough to attack anyone. Enough to clear debris after monsoon floods. Clara saw another use. If a ram hits while the chamber releases. Nisha nodded. It won't stop the ram. No, it changes the angle. They looked at each other. Tom, overhearing from above, muttered, I hate when you two get that look. Clara ignored him. They tested the lever once. The gate moved with a deep wooden groan. Clara marked the safe pressure line with chalk. Too much and we crack our own hinge. Nisha said, then don't use too much. Excellent technical advice. Thank you. The evening meal was eaten early. Beans again, salt pork, cornbread, pickled peppers. Nobody had much appetite, so Tom ate enough for everyone and pretended this was an act of morale. Blackwood lay on a cot near the kitchen stove with his splinted leg raised. He looked uncomfortable being inside the home of people his employer intended to kill. At one point he said, if Thorne gets through, don't let him take me alive. Clara tore cornbread in half. No. Blackwood stared. No, we're not rearranging the entire night around your guilt. Tom coughed into his cup to hide a laugh. Clara continued, if he gets through, you crawl under the table like everybody else with a broken leg. Nisha drank coffee. Blackwood looked at him. Does she talk to everyone like this? Mostly people she likes. Clara nearly choked. Blackwood smiled for the first time. It vanished when the first distant rifle shot echoed from the gorge. Everyone went still. Nisha set down his cup. Positions. The word changed the room. Tom took the north wall. The brothers split east and west. Blackwood received a revolver but no ammunition until Clara noticed and shoved 6 cartridges into his palm. I thought you didn't trust me, he said. I don't, but I trust Thorne less. Nisha walked to the cedar gates. Clara followed. The night outside was windless. Dust hung low over the pass. Far down the road, lanterns moved like orange beads. Too many. Nisha rested one hand on the gate. You stay inside the pressure chamber until Grissom reaches the west wall. Then I become his problem. That wasn't the plan. The plan was made before we knew his exact route. Clara, she lowered her voice, if he gets over that wall, Tom can't leave his position without exposing the north. You can't abandon the gate. I'm the one who can move through the inner channels. Nisha's hand tightened on the cedar. I know. This time the words sounded like surrender. Clara touched his wrist. It was the first time she had initiated such a gesture. Hold the front, she said. I'll hold the inside. He turned his hand and briefly closed it around hers. No promise passed between them. They had no use for promises that might outlive the people making them. Then they separated. Down the pass, a man shouted. A second voice answered. Chains rattled. The first heavy thud of the battering ram struck the cedar gates and shook dust from the rafters. The siege had begun. The first blow did not damage the gate much. It frightened the horses in the inner yard and knocked a clay cup from a shelf in the kitchen. Clara heard it shatter as she dropped into the pressure chamber beneath the western hinge. The room was low enough that Nisha had to crawl when he inspected it. Clara could stand bent at the waist. 2 iron levers rose from the stone floor. Moisture beaded on the walls. The main water line moved beneath her boots with a steady vibration. The second blow came harder. Wood boomed against wood. Men cheered outside. Clara put one palm on the western valve and listened. Through the wall she could hear the scrape of the ram being pulled back. Chains, boots. Grissom's men working in rhythm. She waited. A third strike. Splinters hissed through the cracks above. Nisha had told her the gate would survive 6 clean hits before the outer face began to fail. 8 before the center braces shifted. After that, nobody knew. The Syndicate men did not know either. That uncertainty belonged to Clara. She eased the first valve open. Water entered the gate chamber. The stone around her changed tone, a low hum sharpening as pressure rose. Outside, Preston Thorne stood behind the ram line with a lantern held high. He had brought 26 men. Some were sober. Many were not. A cedar trunk hung from chains between 2-wheeled frames. Its nose had been wrapped in iron. 12 men pulled it back, then ran it forward against the gate. Others fired at the parapets to keep defenders down. Nisha stood above the center arch behind a chest-high stone wall. He made himself visible on purpose. Every eye went to him. Thorne pointed. Bring him down. Rifle fire sparked against rock. Nisha moved only when he had to. He was not trying to win a shooting contest. He was keeping their attention where Clara needed it. The ram swung back. Clara opened the second valve. A high whistle came from hidden vents in the gate foundation. Men outside stopped shouting. The sound rose until it resembled wind forced through a narrow chimney, eerie and metallic in the closed canyon. Someone yelled, "What is that?" Thorne shouted for them to keep moving. The ram charged. Clara watched the chalk line on the pressure pipe. Not yet. Not yet now. She yanked the bypass lever. Water slammed into the hydraulic pocket beneath the gate. The western leaf kicked outward less than 2 feet. That was enough. The ram hit at an angle. Instead of driving straight into the center brace, the iron nose skidded across the moving timber. The suspended log swung sideways with all the momentum of 12 running men. It struck the support frame. The frame collapsed. One wheel snapped. The rear end of the ram spun around and smashed into a supply wagon. Men scattered. 2 were knocked flat by the chain harness. Another went headfirst into mud left by the previous water release. Nobody died, but the organized rhythm disappeared. The hidden vents screamed again. A fine mist pushed through the gate seams, cooling the dust and coating lantern glass. The attackers stared at the wall as if it were breathing. Clara eased the pressure down before the hinge cracked. Above her, Nisha shouted only once, "Go home!" Thorne answered with a bullet. It struck the parapet inches from Nisha's hand. The rancher looked at the chip in the stone, then at Thorne. He did not return fire. That seemed to anger Thorne more. Again, Thorne screamed at his men, "Get the ram up!" Half the hired hands moved toward the wreck. The other half did not. Clara left the pressure chamber. She moved through the narrow pantry passage and climbed toward the western wall. Blackwood's map had been exact. Grissom was coming from behind. She heard him before she saw him, a grunt, stone scraping leather. Then the soft curse of a large man forcing himself over a wall built to discourage exactly that. Clara crouched on a ledge above the inner courtyard. Grissom dropped from the parapet. 2 men came after him. The first landed badly and twisted an ankle. The second caught his coat on a cedar spike and had to cut himself free. Grissom waved them toward a lower corridor. Gate controls inside. Find it. Clara backed into shadow. The inner ranch had always seemed practical rather than strange to her. Now she saw it through Grissom's eyes. Nothing lined up. Stone walls met at awkward angles. Passages narrowed unexpectedly. Some corridors ended at a blank wall because the original route had been diverted around a spring vent decades earlier. Others stepped up or down for no visible reason. Nisha had built around the land instead of flattening it. To someone who did not know the pattern, the courtyard was a maze. Clara had raked gravel along the main walkways. Grissom's boots sounded enormous. Crunch, pause, crunch. She moved above him along a maintenance shelf only 18 inches wide. At the first junction, she kicked a pebble into the east passage. Grissom turned toward the sound. One of his men whispered, "I saw her." He had not. They went east. Clara dropped behind them and pulled a cedar pin from a wall niche. A low stone gate slid across the passage behind the last man. The 2 hired guns spun. What the hell? Grissom was now separated from them. "Find another way," he shouted. Clara continued toward the narrow core. He heard her then, a soft scuff of boot on stone. "Vance!" She did not answer. Grissom's pace quickened. "You little rat, I know you're in here." Clara turned into a slit between 2 walls. The gap was less than a foot wide. She slid through sideways. Behind her, Grissom stopped. For several breaths neither moved. Then he tried to enter. His shoulder jammed almost immediately. He backed up and hit the opening again harder. Stone scraped his coat. "Come out." Clara stood on the other side, close enough to smell whiskey on his breath. "No. You think hiding makes you strong?" "No. It makes me hard to shoot." Grissom shoved one arm into the gap. His fingers reached within inches of her shirt. Clara stepped back. He snarled, "This whole place is tricks, water tricks, rock tricks. You got that giant doing your fighting." Clara looked at his trapped shoulder. "Silas, you're stuck in a wall. This is not the time to criticize technique." He roared and forced himself deeper. That was what she needed. Clara reached into a recessed slot and pulled the iron handle inside. A counterweighted slab dropped behind Grissom with a ground-shaking thud. Dust filled the passage. The enforcer jerked backward, but the way he had come was now closed. He was trapped in a short stone chamber between the slit and the fallen slab. He could not follow Clara. He could not rejoin his men. He hammered his revolver butt against the stone. "Open it!" Clara coughed dust from her throat. "It opens from the other side. Then go to the other side. Eventually." He cursed her for several seconds without repeating himself much, which Clara privately considered impressive. Then he became quiet. Thorne gets through that gate. You know what he'll do to you? Clara leaned her forehead against the cool stone. I know what he wants to do. You could have walked away. He would have let you. Maybe. So why stay? Clara thought of her mother's ribbon buried inside the eastern vent, the first dinner of burned corn cakes, Nisha shortening no tool for her because he expected her to do that herself. Tom's ugly tamping handle, the sound of water returning after she cleared a blockage. Because leaving every time somebody bigger wants the room is how men like you end up owning everything. Grissom struck the wall once more. Clara went on. She found his 2 men at the next junction. One raised a rifle. Clara pulled the lamp cord beside her. Darkness dropped over the corridor. The man fired at where she had been. The muzzle flash showed Clara exactly where both attackers stood. She yanked a second cord. A suspended rawhide screen dropped from the ceiling and tangled the rifle barrel. Tom Rusk appeared from a side passage and struck the weapon away with a shovel handle. The injured man surrendered immediately. His companion needed more persuasion from Tom's shoulder. "Where's Grissom?" Tom asked. "Considering architecture. Alive? Unfortunately for him." Tom grinned and tied the prisoners with wet rawhide. A tremendous crash came from the gate. Clara's smile disappeared. That wasn't the ram. She ran. Outside the western arch, Thorne had abandoned the damaged battering machine. He had ordered a supply wagon driven toward the gate instead. The wagon carried spare ammunition, tools, chains, lamp oil, and enough iron fittings to weigh nearly a ton. Men pushed from behind while horses pulled from the front. If it hit the weakened gate, mass alone might break the center brace. Nisha descended from the parapet. Tom shouted from the courtyard. "Boss!" Nisha did not look back. He walked into the passage as bullets struck dust around him. Thorne emptied a revolver from behind the wagon. One bullet tore through Nisha's sleeve. Another grazed his side. He kept moving. Clara reached the interior viewing slit in time to see him place both hands on the wagon's front sideboard. For one absurd second, she thought he intended to stop the entire vehicle. He did something smarter. He tore out the axle retaining pin. The pin was thick iron, but the wagon had been battered in the earlier wreck, and the housing was cracked. Nisha braced one boot against the wheel hub, twisted and pulled. The pin came free. The left front wheel rolled away. The wagon dropped like a wounded animal. Crates slid off the bed. Ammunition boxes burst in the dirt. A barrel of lamp oil rolled under the chassis and cracked open harmlessly away from flame. The horses, freed from forward pressure, dragged the broken tongue sideways. Men scattered again. Nisha stood beside the collapsed wagon, breathing hard. His shirt darkened at the ribs. Clara saw it. Blood. She started toward the outer door, then stopped. If she left the controls, Thorne would still have 20 men, and the gate would still be damaged. Nisha looked toward the viewing slit. He could not possibly see her behind it, but he raised one hand. "Stay." Clara closed her eyes for half a second. Then she went back to the water chamber. The final defense was one they had hoped not to use. The upper overflow held enough water to flood the lower gorge. Not a wall high enough to sweep men away, if released in stages, but enough to turn hard-packed dust into knee-deep mud, disable wagons, and make mounted movement impossible. It would also damage the ranch road and risk undercutting the Western Gate foundation. Nisha had said it plainly that afternoon. "If we open full flow, we may save the ranch and lose the gate." Clara had answered, "A gate can be rebuilt." Now she put both hands on the main release. Outside, Thorne had found another group willing to advance. They carried ropes and hooks, planning to pull loose the damaged cedar face. Clara opened the first stage. Water surged into the lower vents. A low rumble passed through the ground. Men looked down. Nothing happened yet. She opened the second. A stream burst from the north wall and crossed the trail. Then another from the south. The streams met around the wrecked wagon. Dust became paste. Boots sank. Thorne shouted for the men to keep moving. Clara opened the third. The gorge changed. Water erupted from the hidden spillways in a broad, cold rush carrying silt, leaves, and small stones. It spread across the trail, climbed over boots, surrounded wheels and hooves. Horses backed instinctively toward higher ground, rifles lowered as men fought for balance. A team hitched to the reserve wagon panicked and turned. The wagon slewed crosswise, blocking half the retreat. No one needed to tell the hired men what came next. They began leaving. Thorne grabbed one by the coat. "You were paid." The man shoved him away. "Not to drown, it's 2 feet of water." Then you stand in it. The man climbed the ridge. Others followed. The line dissolved. Thorne looked toward the cedar gates. Nisha stood in front of them, one hand pressed to his bleeding side. Clara emerged from the inner passage and joined him. She was soaked to the waist from a leaking control valve. Dust streaked her face. Her hair had come loose again. Thorne stared at the two of them. "Do you understand what you've done?" he shouted over the water. "This company owns half the range south of here. We have judges, banks, freight contracts. You think a ditch and a wall make you untouchable?" Nisha said no. Thorne waited. Nisha pointed to the fleeing men. "They make you touchable." Thorne's face went pale. He raised his revolver. Clara saw the motion first. She grabbed Nishiji's vest and pulled. The shot went wide. Tom fired from the parapet, not at Thorne, but at the revolver. The bullet struck the mud beside his hand. Thorne dropped the weapon by instinct. Blackwood's voice came from the gatehouse. "Enough, Preston." Everyone turned. Blackwood stood on his good leg with the other splinted and braced on a crude crutch. He held the revolver Clara had given him. Thorne stared as if the dead had climbed from the ground. "Josiah." I wrote it down. Thorne's expression changed. Blackwood continued, "All of it. Poison. Powder. Intake. Tonight. Names too. You miserable. Ely's already riding." Thorne lunged toward his dropped gun. Nisha moved faster. He put one boot on the revolver and slid it away through the mud. For a moment the two men faced each other at arm's length. Thorne looked small beside him. But Clara had learned better than to confuse size with danger. Thorne's danger had always lived elsewhere, in signatures, borrowed authority, hired hunger. Now most of those things had washed away. "Kill me then," Thorne said. Nisha's face remained still. "No. Why? So you can parade me to your marshal." "No." Nisha looked toward the basin. "Because you're leaving." The contempt in that was worse than violence. Thorne stood in cold water while his remaining men abandoned him. At last he turned and climbed toward the outer ridge. Clara watched until he disappeared. Only then did her knees begin to shake. Nisha swayed. She caught his arm. "Sit down, I'm fine. You're bleeding through your shirt." "Grazed." "Sit." "Clara, I crawled into a mountain and dragged out one stubborn man today. Don't make me do it twice." Tom laughed from above. Nisha gave him a look and sat on the broken wagon tongue. Clara cut his shirt open at the side. The bullet had scored a deep line across the ribs but had not entered. She cleaned it with boiled water and whiskey from the gatehouse. Nisha hissed. "You can lift a wagon but not hold still for whiskey?" Wagon didn't sting. She bandaged him tightly. The water receded into channels. Mud covered the lower pass. Broken wood dropped hats. Bent iron and two abandoned rifles lay where the Syndicate line had been. The ranch had survived. The western gate leaned crooked. One hinge was split. A section of the outer wall had lost 3 capstones. The road would need weeks of work. Clara had never seen anything more beautiful. She and Nisha stood under the arch as the sky turned pale. He was exhausted enough that his shoulders had lost their usual square line. Clara leaned against the post. Neither spoke. After a while, Nisha said, "You were right. About what?" "Gate can be rebuilt." Clara looked at the cracked hinge. "Don't get sentimental. Wouldn't dream of it." He bent suddenly and lifted her. Clara made an undignified noise. "Put me down." Nisha set her on his shoulder. From there the basin opened beneath her. She could see the green lines of the channels, the roofs, the corrals, the steam of horses in the cold dawn. The view startled her. She had spent so long measuring the world from below that height felt like a new language. "This is ridiculous," she said. "Probably. Tom is looking. Tom has poor manners." From the parapet, Tom shouted, "I can hear you!" Clara laughed until her ribs hurt. Nisha lowered her carefully. The moment passed without becoming anything else. That, too, felt right. They had work. The law arrived mid-morning. Marshal Amos Bell rode at the head of 6 deputies, with Ely beside him bareheaded and sunburned. Behind them came 3 county riders and a territorial clerk who looked deeply offended by mud. They met Preston Thorne less than a mile from the pass. By the time the party reached the Cedar gates, Thorne's hands were tied in front of him. Silas Grissom was still inside the stone cell. Clara had nearly forgotten him. When Tom removed the counterweight and raised the slab, Grissom emerged stiff, filthy, and quieter than she had ever seen him. He looked at Clara once. He did not call her little. Deputies shackled him. Marshal Bell dismounted and surveyed the damage. His mustache was gray. His hat had a sweat line so old it looked permanent. "Which one of you is Vance?" Clara stepped forward. Bell looked down. His eyebrows rose before he could stop them. Clara waited. The marshal cleared his throat. Ellie said you found Blackwood. Blackwood found a limestone slab. I found both of them. Bell glanced toward the gatehouse where the scout sat with his splint. He willing to repeat the statement? Blackwood called every word. Thorne said, he's a thief and a deserter. His statement is worthless. The territorial clerk opened a leather case. Mr. Thorne, perhaps you should save arguments for a magistrate. Thorne looked at him. Do you know who employs your office? The clerk's face reddened. Marshal Bell smiled without humor. That sentence alone made my morning. The investigation took hours. Deputies collected the poison grain Clara had sealed in a jar. They inspected the powder crates, turned to sludge the pry marks at the intake, the oilskin case of detonators found at the Syndicate camp. Blackwood gave names. 2 hired men, eager to avoid being treated as principals, gave more. Thorne stopped talking before noon. Grissom never started. Bell took them both. Blackwood would go too once a wagon could carry him. Sabotage did not disappear because he regretted it, and Clara had no interest in pretending otherwise. He knew that. Before leaving, he asked her to come to the gatehouse. His brass telescope lay across his lap. He held it out. Take it. Clara frowned. Why? I used it to look for weaknesses, and found fake ones. Exactly. He gave a tired smile. You saw more without it. Maybe you'll make better use of the thing. Clara took the telescope. The brass was scratched and dented. One lens rim had a chip from the sunlight she had thrown into it days earlier. This doesn't settle anything, she said. I know. Saving you doesn't either. I know that too. She nodded. It was enough. When the law wagons disappeared, Nisha walked to the damaged wall and put his hand on a fallen boulder. Clara looked at him. You are not lifting that today. Needs moving. Your side is stitched. Stone does not care. I do. The words came out before she could reshape them. Nisha stopped. Clara felt heat rise in her face and became annoyed at herself. Which means, she added, I don't want to crawl into another stupid hole because you tear yourself open. Nisha's eyes softened. Of course. Don't start. He sat on the boulder instead. That was the closest he came to obedience. Help arrived before noon the next day. Miller, the rancher from the southern flats, rode through the pass with 4 men and a wagon stacked with seasoned cedar. Clara knew him. He had been in the settlement the day she asked about work. When someone joked that she should mend shirts instead of fences, Miller had laughed. Now he stopped 10 yards from the damaged gate. Nisha stood under the arch. Miller looked past him. At Clara, he removed his hat. Not a courtly gesture, a rancher's acknowledgement. Miss Vance, Mr. Miller. He glanced at the wreckage. Saw the water from my north ridge. Heard gunfire most of the night. Brought timber if you'll have it. Nisha said nothing. He looked at Clara. Miller noticed. So did she. The decision had been passed to her. We'll have it, Clara said. Unloaned by the lower hinge. Your men can help clear silt first. Don't move the black stones by the west wall. They're marking a pressure line. Miller nodded. No smile. No comment about her giving orders. You heard her, he told his men. They went to work. Over the next week, the ranch became a construction site. The practical aftermath of survival was less dramatic than the siege and more exhausting. Mud had to be shoveled from the lower corrals. The road needed drainage cuts. 3 gate beams were replaced. The western hinge had to be heated in the forge, hammered straight, cooled, fitted, removed, heated again, and fitted once more. Clara slept harder than she ever had. Every morning she woke before sunrise to the sound of someone already working. Nisha healed badly because he disliked rest. Clara solved this by assigning him jobs that could be done sitting, then pretending the arrangement was necessary for efficiency rather than health. He pretended not to notice. Tom Rusk became insufferably pleased with himself after successfully installing a pressure gauge, Clara designed from a salvaged boiler fitting. Eli returned from the territorial seat with news that Thorne and Grissom would face charges related to attempted arson, poisoning, assault, conspiracy, and property destruction. The company's lawyers had arrived almost immediately and begun insisting Thorne acted outside authorization. Of course they did, Clara said. They'll try to keep the company name clean, Eli said. Nisha fitted a cedar shim into the gate. Names wash easier than hands. Blackwood agreed to testify in exchange for consideration, though no one expected him to walk free. Clara was glad. Mercy, she had discovered, did not require pretending consequences were cruelty. The company sent a lawyer before it sent an apology. His name was Edwin Vale. He arrived in a hired carriage 2 weeks after the siege, wearing a light gray suit, chosen by someone who had never seen Arizona dust. He brought 1 driver, 1 leather case, and no armed men. Clara almost respected the change in tactics. Nisha received him at the kitchen table. Vale declined coffee, then reconsidered after the wind pushed a sheet of grit under the door. He placed 3 documents in front of them. Southwestern Range does not condone Mr. Thorne's conduct, he said. The board considers his actions a severe departure from company policy. Clara glanced at Nisha. Nisha looked at his coffee. Vale continued. We are prepared to withdraw all immediate claims against the Central Basin parcel. In addition, the company will compensate documented structural damage arising from the unfortunate confrontation. Unfortunate confrontation, Clara repeated. Vale folded his hands. I understand emotions remain high. Our gate was rammed by 20 men. That's less an emotion than a measurement. The lawyer breathed in slowly. Miss Vance, my role is to prevent further harm. Good. Prevent your company from coming back. Vale slid the second paper forward. It was a settlement offer. The number at the bottom was larger than any amount Clara had ever seen written beside a $sign. She read the conditions. Nisha watched her face. The company would pay for repairs and recognize Nisha's current use of the basin. In exchange, he would grant Southwestern Range a permanent easement to draw water during declared drought periods and agree not to support competing claims from neighboring ranchers. Clara read the last clause again. There was Thorne's plan wearing clean clothes, not seizure, dependency. How many gallons? She asked. Vale hesitated. The easement specifies a reasonable seasonal share. That's not a number. It would be determined by need. Whose? The company's herds, balanced against local conditions. By whom? Vale stopped. Clara pushed the paper back. No. The lawyer looked at Nisha. Mr. Ironstalk, perhaps you would prefer to discuss the financial. Nisha pointed at Clara. She answered. Vale's professional calm slipped for the first time. With respect, her name does not appear on the current title. The room went still. Clara felt the old reflex, the instinct to step back when paper declared she did not belong in a decision. Nisha stood. He did not loom over Vale intentionally. He simply had no other way to stand. Then your paper is behind, he said. Vale gathered his documents more quickly than he had arranged them. At the door he paused. The board will not simply abandon access to a resource of this importance. Clara said, then tell them to buy land with water on it. There is no comparable source. That's why this one isn't cheap. Vale looked back. Everything has a price. Nisha opened the door. Cold wind entered the kitchen. No, he said. Everything has a cost. Men like Thorne confuse the two. Vale left. Clara watched his carriage disappear toward the pass. They'll be back with better language. Yes, maybe better numbers. Yes. She looked at Nisha. You ever tempted? He considered the basin beyond the window, the repaired gate, the thin green line of cottonwoods. To sell? To take enough money that you never have to repair another wall. Nisha rubbed the scar at his thumb. Money cannot tell me where to put my hands when water stops. Clara understood what he meant. A bank account could buy lumber. It could not replace knowledge of which vent whistled before a blockage, which stones shifted after frost, which neighbor needed 2 hours of overflow before dawn. The company's offer had been enormous because it still misunderstood the thing it wanted. It believed the basin's value could be separated from the people who knew how to keep it alive. Clara folded the rejected settlement once and used the blank back to sketch a new brace for the western hinge. One morning she returned to the Acequias alone. The tunnel smelled different after the siege. More silt, fresh wood where braces had been replaced, iron sharpened by new scratches. Clara carried a lamp and the short pick. At the secondary junction she found a tiny green shoot pushing from a bed of damp sediment. Cottonwood. 2 leaves no bigger than fingernails. It had no business there. Clara crouched. A seed must have traveled through the flood and lodged where a little indirect light reached the vent from above. The sprout had found moisture in a crack between stones. She could have pulled it. Roots would eventually threaten mortar if it grew large. Instead, she moved it carefully to a wider silt pocket near the maintenance opening where it could be transplanted later. She built a small ring of smooth pebbles around it so nobody stepped on it. When she climbed out, Nisha was sitting near the intake repairing harness. Find trouble? He asked. A tree. He looked at the stone hatch. Inside, very small tree. Then it chose badly. Maybe it chose protection. Nisha considered that. You moving it? When it has roots. Good. A month passed. Monsoon rain washed the last Syndicate tracks from the lower flats. Grass returned where wagon wheels had torn the soil. The gate scars silvered at the edges. Clara stopped thinking of her room as the room Nisha had given her. It became simply her room. Her spare gloves hung by the back door. Her altered saddle lived on the third rack. A shelf in the kitchen acquired her tin of tea because Nisha's coffee after supper was destroying her sleep. Nobody asked how long she planned to stay. That question had become unnecessary. One afternoon, a territorial clerk arrived carrying a leather folio. He was not the same young man who had accompanied Marshal Bell. This one was older and more cautious. He spent an hour with Nisha at the kitchen table, producing copies of older land records, affidavits from neighboring ranchers, and a revised filing concerning the basin's water use. Clara stayed outside at first. Paperwork had always made her feel like somebody else's decision. Her father had signed away equipment without telling her. Employers had written wages on scraps she could not enforce. Men like Thorne used documents to turn theft into procedure. Nisha called her in. A single page lay apart from the rest. "Read it," he said. Clara wiped her hands and sat. The document named Nisha Ironstalk as principal holder of the Basin Ranch under recognized prior occupation and recorded water use. Below that was a partnership declaration granting Clara Vance an undivided working interest in the ranch operations and water infrastructure, with survivorship rights and authority over maintenance decisions. Clara read it twice. Then a third time. "What's this?" Nisha looked at her as if the question were foolish. "Paper. I can see that. You keep complaining paper matters. I complain about bad paper, so make this good." She looked at the clerk. He suddenly found his ink bottle fascinating. "Nisha, you saved the water. You know the system. You rebuilt the gate. Miller listens when you speak. Tom listens eventually." From the yard, Tom shouted, "I heard that." Nisha did not raise his voice. "Good." Clara stared at the partnership line. "You don't owe me this." "No." That answer stopped her. He folded his hands. "Debt ends. Work continues. I do not want a debt. I want the person who knows what happens to this place when I am not standing here." The room became very quiet. Clara had imagined belonging many times in her life. Usually it wore sentimental clothes. A family asking her to stay, a husband building a smaller chair, a town finally deciding not to laugh. This was none of those things. This was authority, responsibility. The right to argue about valves and cattle and winter feed with consequences attached. It was far more frightening. She picked up the pen. Her signature was small and precise. Clara Vance. Nisha did not write his name. Instead, he pressed his thumb into the clerk's black ink and set the print beside her signature. The clerk sanded the page and blew gently across it. "That will file in Prescott within the week." Clara touched the dry edge of the paper. Nisha stood. "Fourth vent needs checking." She looked up at him. "You just made me your partner and now you're sending me into a pipe?" "Our pipe." Clara smiled. "That is annoyingly effective." They went to work. By autumn, travelers had begun using a new name for the canyon entrance. Clara heard it first from a freight driver who stopped for water. "Road to Clara's Gate clear?" he asked Tom. Clara, stacking cedar wedges nearby, turned around. Tom's face went blank with innocence. "What did he call it?" The driver looked confused. "Clara's Gate. That's what they're calling the pass in town." Clara stared at Tom. "Did you start that?" "No." "Ely?" "Possibly." Eli from the forge shouted, "Wasn't me." The driver slowly backed his horse away from the domestic argument. Nisha emerged from the stone shed carrying a wrench. "Problem?" Clara pointed toward the pass. "They renamed it." "Who?" "Apparently everyone." "Did they ask the gate?" "No." "Then gate may ignore them." He walked on. Clara followed him with her eyes. "You're enjoying this." "Maybe." That evening she took a small iron chisel to the left cedar leaf. She did not carve her name. Names could become statues too easily. And Clara had no wish to turn a place into an argument about herself. Instead, she carved a simple pattern at her eye level, 3 circles connected by straight lines, based on the junctions of the Acequias beneath the courtyard: intake, gate, basin, water, barrier, home. The chisel clicked steadily in the cooling air. Nisha came to stand several yards away. He did not ask what the symbol meant. He already knew. Clara brushed cedar dust from the groove. "Crooked," she said. "A little." She glared at him. "You could lie. Bad foundation. It's a carving." "Same rule." She laughed and fixed the line. The cottonwood sprout survived transplanting. They moved it from the vent to a damp patch near the lower channel just before the first frost. Clara built a low stone ring around it. Nisha said the ring was excessive. Clara reminded him he had once built a wall 8 feet thick around a ranch house. He stopped criticizing the ring. Winter came late that year. The first hard frost silvered the sage and turned the trough rims white. Steam rose from cattle at dawn. The Acequias ran under the frozen ground, protected by stone and depth, their steady current audible only at the vents. Clara learned the winter version of the basin. She learned which hinge complained in cold weather, which horses needed blankets, how Nisha mixed ash into mud mortar when temperatures dropped. She learned that Tom cheated at cards and Eli did not, but Eli won more often anyway. She also learned that peace required maintenance. The Syndicate did not vanish from the territory. The Southwestern Range and Cattle Company replaced Thorne with men who wore lighter coats and used softer language. Their lawyers contested pieces of the case for months. They claimed rogue employees, misunderstood boundaries, and unauthorized tactics. But the testimony held. So did the neighbors. Miller and 3 other ranchers filed affidavits confirming the basin's long-standing water use. Smallholders downstream, suddenly aware of how close they had come to losing access, began cooperating on repairs and seasonal sharing schedules. Thorne's campaign had tried to isolate Nisha. Instead, it had shown everyone what isolation would cost. Blackwood went to prison for sabotage and conspiracy. He wrote Clara once. The letter was brief. He said his leg had healed badly, and the prison doctor thought he would always limp. He did not ask forgiveness. He reported that Thorne blamed everyone but himself, and that Grissom had stopped talking about the little woman after other prisoners heard the story of the stone cell. At the bottom, Blackwood wrote one sentence. I used to think a good scout was the man who found a weakness first. I was wrong about what to look for. Clara folded the letter and put it in the same drawer as the partnership deed. She did not answer. Some debts did not need continued correspondence. Spring brought water louder than any season Clara had yet heard. Snowmelt from the high ridges filled the upper reservoir until the pressure vents throbbed beneath her fingers. She spent 3 weeks inspecting every narrow branch. The blue silk ribbon remained buried behind the repaired eastern slab. Clara could not see it. She knew exactly where it was. She never tried to retrieve it. One morning she sat beside the lower channel and watched the young cottonwood put out new leaves. The tree had grown past her knee. Nisha approached carrying 2 fence posts. Needs more room, he said. Clara looked at the stone ring. The ring? Roots, I know. They moved the stones outward together. Nisha lifted the heavy ones. Clara reset the small wedges so the circle would hold on uneven ground. When they finished, the tree stood inside a wider boundary. Clara wiped dirt from her hands. There. Nisha looked at the cottonwood. It will break that ring too. Then we move it again. And again, if we have to. He nodded. Good plan. Years later, people would tell the story incorrectly. They would make Nisha taller, because stories prefer giants to ordinary scale. They would make Clara smaller, because stories enjoy contrast. They would turn the hydraulic vents into magic, the rock slide into an avalanche, the siege into a battle with 100 armed men. Some would say Clara killed 3 gunmen. She did not. Some would say Nisha threw a wagon over the wall. He would have considered that a waste of a repairable axle. Some would say they fell in love during the siege and married before winter. The truth was quieter, and to Clara, better. They became partners. They argued over tools. They divided work according to skill rather than pride. They sat in the kitchen when storms closed the pass and listened to water move under the floor. They disagreed about cattle breeds, hinge design, coffee strength, and whether Tom Rusk was worth keeping after he accidentally set fire to a hay tarp during branding season. They trusted each other with decisions that could ruin them both. That was enough. When Nisha's old wound stiffened in cold weather, Clara took more of the upper trail inspections. When Clara's hands swelled after long days in icy vents, Nisha heated stones by the stove and wrapped them in cloth without comment. Neither called these acts tenderness. They did not need to. The basin continued because thousands of small tasks were done before they became emergencies. Cedar was oiled, stone was reset, water was listened to, grain was checked, neighbors were answered. Records were copied and stored in 3 separate places, so no single clerk could make a history disappear again. Clara insisted on that last part. The territorial clerk in Prescott complained about duplicate filings. She sent a 4th. By the 5th year, the name Clara's Gate appeared on freight schedules. Nobody knew exactly when gossip became geography. Clara never approved it. She never stopped it either. One autumn morning, she stood at the pass before sunrise with Blackwood's old telescope in her hand. The brass had been polished but not repaired. The chip on the lens rim remained. Through it, she could see a wagon approaching from the south, one family aboard 2 milk cows tied behind. Settlers, not company scouts. She lowered the glass. The cedar gate stood open. Nisha came up beside her. Age had added more silver to his hair. It had not made him less enormous, though Clara suspected the stories were beginning to outrun reality. Who? He asked. Family from Ironstalk. He said they might come through. Need water? Everybody needs water. They waited as the wagon approached. The driver was young. His wife sat beside him holding a sleeping child. When he recognized Nisha, he straightened nervously. Then he saw Clara and relaxed. That amused her. Morning, he called. This Clara's gate? Clara glanced at Nisha. He looked solemn. Apparently, she said. The wagon rolled inside. The child woke as the wheels crossed the threshold and stared at Nisha with enormous eyes. Then at Clara. Are you the lady the gate's named for? The mother flushed. Martha. Clara crouched until she was level with the child. The gate was here first. The girl considered this carefully. Then why'd they name it after you? Clara looked at the cedar. Her small carved symbol remained near the hinge, darkened by years of oil and weather. Because people like naming things after the trouble they remember. The child nodded as if that made perfect sense. Nisha turned away so the family would not see him smile. After the wagon moved on, Clara walked to the lower channel. The cottonwood had become a real tree. Its roots had broken the second stone ring 2 years earlier. They had moved the stones outward again. Now the trunk was thick enough that both of Clara's hands barely circled it. Leaves whispered above the water. She rested her palm against the bark. Behind her, Nisha set down a bundle of cedar wedges. Fourth vent, he asked. Checked yesterday. Third, running slow. Silt? Probably. He handed her the short spade she had brought to the ranch years ago. The handle had been replaced twice. The blade was narrower now, sharpened by work. Clara took it. They walked toward the mountain together. At the intake, the air smelled of wet limestone and cold cedar. The sound from inside was steady except for one faint hesitation on the third branch. Clara heard it immediately. Nisha watched her face. There? She nodded. About 40 feet in, maybe gravel. He opened the hatch. Clara tied back her hair with a plain strip of cloth. Nisha checked the rope coil, even though neither expected to need it. Old habits became rituals. Rituals became survival. Clara crouched at the opening. For a moment, she looked back across the basin. Morning light touched the repaired cedar gates, the rooftops, the young cottonwood, the thin smoke from the kitchen chimney. Everything that had once seemed impossibly large now fit inside a single glance. Not because the place had become smaller, because she had stopped measuring herself against it. Nisha held out the lamp. Clara took it. Back before lunch, he said. If Tom cooked, I'll stay in the tunnel. Reasonable. She smiled and crawled into the dark. The stone closed around her shoulders. Cold water touched her hands. Ahead, the Acequias hummed through the mountain, carrying snowmelt toward fields and troughs and roots. Clara moved toward the imperfect note in the current with the easy patience of someone entering a room she knew well. Outside, the gate remained open.